Hi, I'm Valentina Christensen, Director of Growth and Communications at Oaknorth. I'm hosting this podcast from CIPR International on comms in Fintech, and I'm joined by a brilliant group of panellists. So I'm going to ask them each to go around and introduce themselves, starting with Stephanie from Freetrade.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Kendall. I'm the PR and Communications Manager at Freetrade. We are a challenger stockbroker offering commission-free stock investing.
I'm Sharon O'Day. I'm co-founder of communication and collaboration consultancy Lithos Partners. I'm particularly interested in the use of emerging technologies in communications, and I'm a member of the CIPR's AI in PR panel.
Sarah Kachansky, Head of Research at 11FS. 11FS is a challenger consultancy working with companies large and small across all areas of financial services.
And I'm Jess Warner, Director and Partner at Lansons, working with a number of fintech companies here and leading Lansons partnerships with London Fintech Week and London Blockchain Week.
Awesome. So I guess the first thing is, as communicators and practitioners and advisors in the fintech sphere, which fintech brands do you guys think are doing comms really well? What's making them stand out? Jess, maybe if you start.
Yeah, I'll kick off. Well, without wanting to be too obvious, I think Monzo is one to mention. I think they've done for banking what Netflix did for a night in or Brewdog did for beer. I think obviously they've led with transparency, with their radical transparency, as they've called it. So that's impacted the way they communicate with their own staff, revealing all emails that are sent internally. But it also speaks to the app and the way that it works. So I think there's a lot to be learnt from them. Slightly differently, I'm also quite impressed with JP Morgan and the JPM coin that's come out. I think if you don't know much about cryptocurrency and about blockchain, actually learning from their messaging is a pretty good way to do it. They've been so clear and so simple. And just looking at the Q&As on their website, I think it's quite impressive. And then just finally, I'd say on cryptocurrency, that's a space that we've worked a lot in. And last year with the advertising ban, obviously that was a major challenge to how they communicated for obvious reasons. But I think some brands have been really smart and had to get creative. We were working with an exchange called Coin Corner, and actually it just really underlined the value of good editorial media relations and the power of getting that influential journalist endorsement when you can't push things out yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Monzo is a really interesting one because I think you would absolutely hold them as a case study for brilliant comms, but comms to a specific sort of person is what I would say as well about Monzo. So they do what they do very well, and they're the example that springs to mind beautifully every time. But my mum still doesn't get them. Like, she's like, why is there a little dancing card across the front and it's shouting at me and it's neon pink? And
Hot coral.
Yeah, I know. I got told off saying hot coral too many times, so now I'm trying to bring it back down. But yes, you're absolutely right. It is hot coral. So it's really interesting to me that yes, you're absolutely right. What they do is brilliant, and it very well communicates what they're doing and their brand message. The one for me that I like for kind of targeting that slightly broader audience is TransferWise. I think that they're very, very good at explaining, we have done this. It will cost you this much more. This is why we have done this, in a nice email, in an easy to understand tone. And because TransferWise's audience is that much broader, I really like that for kind of mass appeal.
I particularly like the way Starling have managed to do quite traditional communications get through. So looking at campaigns like Make Money Equal, they've managed to get cut through in traditional media and with a kind of a more traditional banking audience and that mature customer in a way that some of the other challengers haven't. And I think that's quite interesting as well. They've also managed to get quite a lot of visibility for their leaders in trad media as well, which I think has been pretty successful for them.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, to kind of echo what you were saying earlier about, Monzo and their transparency, I think that's extremely important, and that's quite key to kind of building your brand and to build that communications. You kind of have to have that underlying transparent, connection with your customers.
But do you think it's down just to PR? I mean, obviously those brands, and Monzo as an example, they do a lot in the event space, right? So you have the sort of the Monzo meetups, they sort of open houses where they host events. Fintech Insider obviously does loads of content creation. I mean, and Monzo and Revolut, Starling, they've all done, I think Tide now as well, they've done, paid for advertising. You see them on the tube. I mean, is that sort of more broad, broad brush marketing, quite effective for those kinds of brands, do you think? Or is it actually, you can probably get quite good value for money just sticking to, traditional PR?
I'd just jump in and say I think Monzo's obviously grown with earned and with word of mouth, and I think 80% of their marketing was initially put into just driving word of mouth, but they're looking at traditional advertising as well, and I think the others are. And I think to an extent a lot of them have, because the competition is only getting more and more significant. There are more and more players. Not only are there true fintechs, but every bank is now branding itself as a fintech business. Every asset manager is a fintech business. So there's a lot of noise. And fintech as a word is slightly becoming meaningless because everyone's jumping on the bandwagon. So I do think there is this sort of got to be everywhere all the time, always on approach to stand out.
I think that's absolutely true. I think that initially word of mouth was enough, but you can't be a bank with just 1.5 million customers, as if, that's a light achievement on Monzo's part. But I think, it's about having that unique selling point and getting that across the broadest possible audience. Of course, there will be some fintechs who don't feel the need to do that big, broad branding thing because they don't actually need that many customers. If you think about, a lot of those private members, cards and associations where a friend has to give you a code and then the members, like a members club, have to, the board has to approve your, application or whatever. It does depend on the kind of product you're launching. I do completely agree with your point about, fintech doesn't necessarily mean very much as a term anymore. But I would say that I don't think I've seen many people ever try and brand themselves as a fintech. I think a lot of people, what's really interesting to me is the banks are trying to brand themselves as fintechs. Yeah. And Monzo's going, we were never a fintech. We were just like an alternative to your traditional bank. Like, why are you calling us a fintech?
But I think it's almost the fintechs that aren't doing it. It's the non-fintech. So I start so many conversations when we start working with new clients who always say, how do I be a fintech business? I know.
The eye roll I just gave you included my entire head there. I apologise. That was not very professional.
But that's just jumping on the bandwagon, isn't it?
Well, it's also because of the valuations, right? Obviously, a tech multiple is going to be much more than a bank multiple. But speaking of valuations, obviously, crowdfunding is an activity or tool that the likes of Monzo, Revolut, I know Freetrade are doing it as well. So, what, Stephanie, do you think are some of the benefits from a comms perspective of doing something like a crowdfund?
Yeah, obviously, PR from that is fantastic, but also kind of building that brand trust, building that loyalty with your customers, having a loyal following. I think it really gives users and your customers an opportunity to actually have a way and a control in your business and to kind of help kind of steer what the products are. They are more loyal, they believe in you, and they're more passionate about you. You can see them defending you on Twitter rather than you having to jump in. If you have that loyal following, they're willing to do it for you.
Yeah, and I do agree that it's a great way to build a community. I think that we should be careful of going, everybody should throw money at the companies they love, because loving a company is not the same as understanding how to invest in a company, as you well know. I appreciate I'm teaching you to suck eggs. I think it worked very well for Monzo. I think it's not going to work for everybody.
I'd probably also add to that building kind of brand advocacy amongst your customers and your investors is a great thing, but it's not a replacement for a traditional communications function
completely.
At all, which is, I think, what we need to avoid, which is because you lose control of the messaging, you lose control of how you're perceived by others. So it's a nice to have, and I think it's great for building that brand equity as well, but it's not a replacement for having a proper PR function.
Yeah.
Okay, so obviously, speaking of having an in-house comms function, a brand that has had quite a bit of difficulty on the PR front recently is Revolut. Whether it was on the Tube ads, the Wired magazine that sort of talked about their toxic culture, and various investigations into the business. So do you think, obviously Revolut has, had a lot of bad press. If you were their agency or in-house head, Sharon, what would be, your advice to them right now?
Or I would probably start with internal communications, because whatever happens on the inside is reflected on the outside, and you can only PR over the cracks to a certain degree. So I think I'd start with making sure they do have kind of a culture that is aligned to the values they claim to espouse, and if that's missing, understand where the gaps are. But then I would probably look at their crisis management function as well.
Right.
It looks like, these things need to balance across the communication mix, both internally and externally.
So obviously, speaking of an internal having a good comms function, Revolut has had quite a few challenges recently. Whether it's on the controversial tube ads, a Wired article that talked about the in quotation marks toxic culture. So if you were Sharon, if you were Revolut's head of comms, or you were an agency advising them, what would be your advice for them? I mean, is it better to sort of start with the internal and try and fix that first, or would you try and look at the external PR and go out to the media and try and fix the external image?
Probably you have to start with a bit of both to have a coherent communication strategy that covers both internal and external. That whatever happens on the inside is reflected on the outside. So you do need to look at having finding some way of developing your internal culture and aligning people to your culture and values. If those are fundamentally broken, you can't really communicate around them. Your best PR agency in the world isn't a miracle worker. But we need to start with, I would say, being strategic and looking at having proper internal communications policies, procedures and channels. And one of the things you find with startups that scale that quickly is that they don't have those kind of processes in place. They don't have a clear set of messaging. They don't have a way of aligning people to that and aligning people to leadership and values in a way that maybe big organisations do.
I was just going to completely agree with that. I think, to be seen as a trustworthy company, you have to be trustworthy. To be seen as a great company, you have to be a great company. I agree. I think internal comms is definitely part of it. I don't think PR can be a plaster. If I was them thinking strategically, I would actually take quite a data-driven approach to how they manage it. So there are really good reputation measurement tools that you can take. So Reputation Institute is one that we've worked with before, and they break reputation down into 7 dimensions. So one is products and services, how good are they? One is innovation, how innovative are you seen? And Revolut are probably ticking the boxes on those. But others are workplace, so your culture, governance, so how ethical are you? Citizenship, what are you giving back? What's your corporate social responsibility? Leadership, how you're being managed. And then the seventh is performance, so profitability. And what they do is score you across all of those, so you can see where you're strong and where you want to maximise and where you're really weak and what you need to work on. And if you're regularly measuring those 7 dimensions, you can see how your reputation shifts, how your scores go up and down. And I think by doing something like that and really thinking about reputation as something that's quite holistic, they could start to shift the dial.
I think that's an interesting perspective. And I excuse me. And for me, what I think they need to have the right checks and balances in place. They need to make sure, they're hiring the right people for the job, that they're making sure that there are certain executives that they have to go to get approval, rather than just making up fake numbers for something that is quote unquote fun or silly. That's just not good PR. That's just not good business.
I think there's also something to be said here about when you are looking at something, particularly like advertising, about external comms. You have to when you decide on an advert, there's always going to be people who may or may not like that advert. Now, I've had this conversation with people many times. The big banks go like vanilla. So like Lloyd's Bank, which has got a horse racing across a beach that nobody quite understands, but nobody's really offended by it. Yeah. Or TSB, who's got a sausage dog that barks every time the butcher... No, it's a dog that barks every time the butcher hands out sausages or something. And I'm like, cute dog. Still a bit lost because it's safer that way. So if you're going to put an advert out there that is going to have some controversy behind it, A, you need to be prepared for that. But B, you also need to have enough different eyes on it to point out that it might be controversial. Yes. So if everybody in the room has the same background, the same education, the same life experience, they're all going to look at it and go, yeah, that's fine. And then you show it to one other person, whether they've got a different background, a different, come from a different country, have different educational background, whether they're a different gender, or any of those things. And they might go, actually, that's a bit off. And if you don't have that other set of eyes on it when you're looking at external comms, you're going to misstep. And a lot of people do misstep with external comms. It's not just Revolut. But I do feel very strongly that a lot of the times when they do misstep, it's because of that. They haven't put it to a broad enough audience who have kind of gone, that offends our group, or like this particular group might see that in a different light, or that word means something different to a large section of people who aren't in this room.
But then when do you feel is the right time, whether it's to bring in, because Sharon, you talked about, being a startup and a lot of them don't necessarily have a comms function internally. So do you think there's an ideal time as a startup or a growing business, a scale up, to bring in a head of comms, or should you always be working with an agency? Should you always have that external pair of eyes?
The answer is always it depends, but this is where agencies can provide a lot of value, because it may not be when startups are at that kind of growth phase, they're unlikely to be able to afford someone or get someone with top level experience. But agencies can provide that as and when it's needed, for example, for reputation management, crisis comms, to help develop a strategy that they can implement. So it's about using your resources carefully and scaling up as the business scales, rather than attempting to build necessarily everything in house.
Right.
But in my mind, and again, I'm speaking, as something of an outsider on this podcast, but would you not want that agency in place from the beginning? Would you not want to know that you had somebody to go to if something went wrong, rather than it's gone wrong? Because I know that in March of this year, there were all these headlines saying Revolut is desperately searching for, or not desperately, Revolut is searching for a new PR agency. And I was like, why wouldn't you have one already? It was my thought.
Well, just in case rather than just in time.
Exactly. Yeah. But things can go wrong for so many people. So that just in case thing, for somebody who isn't in comms, that may be really inappropriate from those of you who do work in the industry. But for me, I'd be like, just in case, to know I've got somebody on the back burner.
Yeah, I mean, I was quite surprised I didn't have one in place already when I heard that you'd think once you've reached unicorn status, particularly in financial services, there are particular constraints that come within working in regulated industry so you do need to think about things like sign-off and process and how you comply with certain advertising codes and so on. So this is where a more experienced agency can provide value. But, once you grow beyond a certain point, you're taking risks with your investors' money if you don't get that kind of high-level strategic advisory, I think.
Well, that's also where I found institutions like the CIPR very helpful, because obviously, I was the first comms hire, in-house comms hire for Oak North, so building the entire, press function from scratch, and didn't have, what I had when I was at Lanson's, where I had a whole agency of people who I could go to for advice and talk to. And I found going to someone like the CIPR and being able to read up on things like, how you can communicate if you're a financial services company on platforms like social media. So how do you find, obviously, Sharon, you remember the CIPR. Jess, I know Lanson's does lots with the CIPR. How have you found the institution to be useful?
Well, I think it's firstly really important for shaping best practice, but I think secondly, it's equipping us as communicators with the arguments to emphasise the importance of reputation management and communications within those businesses. So I think we do a lot more than just issuing press releases and putting out tweets. Talking about Revolut, I think really where our journey should start with businesses is right at the beginning, thinking about what's your purpose, what's your messaging, and then going out there and communicating it. Otherwise, it just feels a bit random and sporadic. But to do that, you need to be respected higher up in businesses, and you need to make the case for reputation. It's not a nice add-on. It should be part of a business's DNA. It should be part of a core. It should be planned strategically from the top. And I think having these sort of conversations, doing the events like the one we're doing tonight, it helps us all be better at our jobs. And if we're all reinforcing this point, and if we're all saying it, it's a much stronger message, and we're going to get through in the end of the day.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think it's extremely important to kind of start from the beginning, is even if you necessarily don't have enough money to afford an outside agency, it's good to just, use CIPR or, some other affiliate to kind of have those guidelines, have that set of standards for communications. Because ultimately, in the fintech industry, in the financial services space, it's extremely important to build that trust with your customers. This is people's money. It could be their entire life savings. And if you're communicating incorrectly, that could affect millions of people. And that has a huge lasting negative effect on individuals.
Very good point. Sarah, I want to direct a question specifically to you, because 11FS has done a fantastic job through content creation. The podcasts you do, the events that you host, obviously the blogs you write, you personally write, contribute to Forbes. So you've managed, 11FS as a consultancy has managed to differentiate itself in a very crowded market and with players who are, much bigger and have been around for decades. So what would be your advice to fintechs who are looking to start a blog or a podcast, or might have these already but want to improve them or increase the audience?
The first thing to point out is that it's taken us 3 years to get the podcast or 300 episodes, I should say, to get the podcast to where it is today. So it's not easy, and it never will be easy. I think from the broadcast perspective, if you like, the podcast perspective, you always need to know who your audience is, and whether that's who your audience is, you want your audience to be, or whether that's people who are already listening to you. If you don't have that in mind to start with, you're likely to sort of veer all over the place. So if you know who your audience is and you know what you want them to experience. So do you want them, for example, with our Fintech Insider news shows, do you want them to learn and have a bit of a giggle? What's the balance between having a bit of a giggle and learning? With the news shows, it's having a bit of a giggle. And with our events after dark, obviously I couldn't possibly speak to everybody who's ever been to one, but I think the reasons they do well is because they are somewhat educational, but they're a lot of fun. And we also do not take ourselves seriously, and we change up the format, and we'll have people running all over the place and up and down, and it's a little bit mad. Yeah. But it's a good evening out, and we know that's okay. We can have a little bit of fun with it. With some of the other podcasts we do, they're very explicitly educational. There are insights shows, and they are design. Val, you were on one a few weeks ago. Designed to give people either an introduction to a subject matter or to educate them on a subject matter. So they can choose, what that is. And so knowing that those are our audiences, splitting them out, having different kind of formats and structures and content is very important. I should also say that one of our assistant producers, Petra, is taking or giving classes on how to start a podcast if anybody's interested.
Oh, right.
So you can grab me at sarah11fs.com and I can point you in his direction. But the other thing with the written side, it's slightly different. I think you can never underestimate the importance of being able to quote your sources and being able to pull back every time. This is where I got this from. This is where I got this from. This is where I got this from. The other thing is with writing, don't be afraid to have a stance, as long as you can back that up. So if you're writing a blog or an article, I write for Forbes, and there are millions of brilliant fintech writers for Forbes. So to get people to read my stuff rather than somebody else's, there's always going to be kind of like, well, whose eyeballs are on the page at that time, or whatever timing's good. But also, I have my opinion, and it's my opinion for these many, many reasons. If you don't like my opinion, that's fine. I'm very happy to engage in a conversation, and I have been known to change my mind. But I have a voice and I have an opinion that I'm expressing, and I very firmly believe, and this is kind of interesting to this audience, but as somebody who is an analyst and a researcher by trade, I don't write what somebody wants me to write. I write what I think. I stand by what I write. And I do understand as a PR agency, sometimes that's a little bit harder to do. But I think that's where you look at the blogs, and we mentioned earlier Monzo, that do so well, is because they actually believe it. They actually can put their money where their mouth is and be like, this is it. Also, never ever go too long. Nobody wants to read 42 pages. Doesn't matter how good your argument is, do not go too long. So I don't know if that's advice or just kind of like stuff I've learned over 10 years of writing and like 3 years of podcasting. Experience actually there's a huge amount you can learn from people who've done it before as well. So always go and ask somebody who's doing it.
So I'll probably add to that know your audience and know what you're trying to achieve with any piece of content, whether that's written or in particular any kind of broadcast material. You have to respect your audience's time. Something that you're watching or listening to takes quite a bit of time to consume the information. So give people something worthwhile. Is that something they can use in their day job? Is it some ammo that makes them sound slightly better informed in a meeting? Actually, because everyone wants to be in fintech now, there's a huge opportunity there for educating other people about fintech. If you help someone to turn up to a meeting looking marginally better informed than their colleagues, you've done them a favour. And that's where there's a huge opportunity there. But we need to recognise that content isn't free. You need to produce it. Good content plays better. And just because you publish something doesn't mean people will read it. So you need to think carefully about your amplification strategy as well, whether, how you interplay that free content with paid so that it gets in front of the right people.
I mean, yeah, I think from our perspective, in terms of, amplification, we have a podcast with guests. So instantly the guests are going to share that material and put it out to their networks. To go back to your point about respecting your audience's time, don't go too long on a podcast either. Don't go. The average commute in London is 45 minutes. The average commute outside of London, I think, is like 20 minutes. So if you give somebody something that's an hour and a half long, you're giving them a Sunday night drama. You're not giving them a kind of, yes, I can listen to this on my way to a meeting and be educated. So you do have to respect people's time at that, because God knows I could talk for as long as, I was allowed to sit in front of a microphone. But I do, believe it or not, have an off switch where I'm like, I've said enough now. People want to get on with their lives. But I think that's true. It's respecting your audience.
Yeah. Okay, well, obviously, I mean, the aim of the discussion is sort of how to differentiate yourself, sort of raise your head above the parapet. And I think a lot of the fintech press that I read personally seems to be focused on challenger banks. And that might be, largely because, they've attracted some of the largest investments in recent years, whether it's sort of double-digit million or triple-digit million investment rounds. But obviously, there's lots of players in the fintech space, from pensions, wealth management, investment, etc. So if you're not sort of announcing double or triple-digit million investment rounds, then what are some of the other ways that you might be able to differentiate yourself, as a smaller brand or a brand that hasn't quite, secured hundreds of millions yet?
Yeah, I think this is a perfect question for Freetrade. So obviously we are, a challenger stockbroker offering commission-free investing, and we're still very new, very early stage. And one of the ways that we've kind of been trying to do it is we're trying to build that trust with our customers. So whether that's through our community forum or through our messaging and having open product roadmaps, we are trying to be as transparent as possible. Obviously we want all of the press in the world, but also at the same time, we're being realistic about what we can get, what we are producing, and what we're really pushing out there. And I think one of the ways that we are really trying to differentiate ourselves, kind of similar to what Monzo did, is they built a loyal fan base. They built trust with their customers. And that's one way that we think is really important, is starting off your business, starting from the right point of view, having that say, being passionate about what we're doing, being able to help individuals save for their financial futures, and really making that part of our message, taking complex, financial services jargon and making it really simple so that anyone and everyone can invest and look at, their future.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, like if you want me to pay attention to you, there's two things you can do. Just as somebody who receives a lot of these communications. One, do something a bit different. Like we joke about the hot coral card or the cards that, the apps that meow when you use them, but it does catch the eye and it does get people talking. And, people like myself, or like people who, I come from an ex-journalism background, you pay attention when everybody else is paying attention. So I've been hearing a lot about this. What is this? I must go and find out because everybody else is talking about it and I want to know what this is. To your point, absolutely, education is a really easy way to get attention. You tell people about something, so particularly with investing or stockbroking, which is a little bit scary,
yes,
and people in this country particularly are not very good at. Free information, but I feel like I'm learning, and at the end of it you're like, by the way, we provide this, without going use us. That educational piece I think is I think there's a big bit missing in UK fintech and financial services on that, and I think that could be, you could both help yourself, your own brand, and the community at large.
So I was about to say something similar, actually. How we need to get some visibility of these brands within the consumer press, because part of the promise of fintech is by reducing the marginal cost of delivery of financial services, we grow the market overall and improve access to those kind of financial products and people who would never previously have considered them. But to do that, we have a uphill battle of hearts and minds to help people understand, well, how do I grow my wealth in the future? What is even out there? Most people's level of financial literacy and understanding of the products on the market is so low. So actually, fintechs can play a role in educating the public, and in doing so get cut through in that kind of media, because the stories fintech got some funding are starting to get a little tired.
It's like you and I have done this before, Sharon.
And I'd just add to that, I mean, you're probably all familiar with this, but we often, when we start work with businesses, just wind right back to their purpose and think about how people don't buy what you do, but why you do it. So that Simon Sinek methodology that we're probably all very familiar with, that, famously Apple really owned. So thinking about your purpose and why you should resonate with your end audience, I think is really important. I think as well with fintechs, I've found that far too many of them, especially on the B2B side, really obsess about the technology they're running on and not what their real world use case is and what they're actually being used for. So particularly with blockchain businesses, you get lost in this endless spiral talking about DLTs, and actually the businesses running on them are really interesting, and the problems that they're trying to solve are really big problems, and the solutions are fascinating. But if you just get lost in the blockchain jargon, it becomes so boring and so undigestible. So I think that's another thing. I mean, the other thing I was going to say was we do a lot of media training with businesses, and we work on a bit of a truth formula, we call it, when we're thinking about how to build campaigns that people are going to be interested in. They're going to get cut through. So it's a bit of an acronym, but the T is, how is it topical? How does it relate to the zeitgeist of the day? The R is relevant. So again, as we were saying earlier, what sort of audience is this relevant to? And slightly changing the emphasis and the depth of information you're giving depending on who the audience is. So topical, relevant, then unusual. So what are your USPs? How is it different? Second T is tension. What are you disrupting? How is this changing? And then finally, human. Who are the people behind this? They're fintech companies, but actually the ones that do well have a bit of character. Their CEO, or you know something about their culture. So I think those are the ingredients for building a campaign that's going to get noticed.
Great. Okay. Well, I guess the final question is sort of to wrap up. I guess, what do you guys think are the biggest challenges for fintech brands in the next 3 to 5 years? I mean, Jess, you mentioned there's a lot of hype and everybody wants to be a fintech. It's a sector that's attracting a lot of investment right now, a lot of customers. But, will the hype still be alive in 3 to 5 years' time if a lot of the business models, haven't quite proven themselves yet? They're still sort of years away from profitability. Are we still going to still see the level of hype that we're seeing now?
So a lot of those businesses in the early years, they were very much focused on acquisition, growth hacking, and rightly so. When you've got a small team trying to prove the value of a proposition, then that's the proper place to concentrate your efforts. But I think as those businesses scale, there's a need to scale and mature their communications function so that you get a seat at the top table, so you're helping them to shape their reputation and ensure that you're communicating your purpose. But also thinking about things like how do we influence the public debate beyond that? So looking at things like public affairs or regulatory affairs, which is something that fintech hasn't really had cut through on. So if you look at any of regulatory bodies, for instance, or advisory bodies at government level, fintechs are really underrepresented there. So I think if we're looking at that, how fintech can shape the policy agenda, for example, moving forward, then it's essential that we start getting the voice of fintech heard at much higher levels across public debate.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think thinking about the challenges that they face, the shifting regulatory environment is surely got to be one of the biggest. And I think especially with newer fintechs, they don't have large compliance teams who can keep pace with this and who have the contacts. Often it's just one poor person trying to keep the grips with everything. So I think absolutely engage with policymakers, engage with the regulator, go to events, talk to them, join APPGs, all of those kind of things. But have a voice. Don't just let the future regulatory landscape be shaped for you. You can actually help shape it at this stage.
Yeah, at the moment, the last time I looked, the Open Banking Advisory Board has one person from a fintech out of 25. So there is a need to ensure that they're getting cut through at that sort of level if it's going to be designed around what people need in the future.
Yeah, I think that's that one's a particularly interesting example because it was, I believe that was done deliberately, but there are other people advising in on from the sides. From my perspective, as somebody as a challenge that a fintech brand will face, it's making people know you're there. So the low hanging fruit is gone. We have everybody who wants to use an independent stock trading app or to use a challenger bank or to use X, Y and Z, whoever who's one of those early adopters, it's gone, it's done, you've missed that. So what you're going to have to do now is either pick up on the fast followers or the mass market, and that's a very different audience. So your brand and the way you communicate will have to change. So to me, that's and then we're starting to see this, and it's fascinating. We've mentioned it today about talking about starting to see tube advertising and things. Now, tube advertising, again, that's not mass market. The people who get on the tube every day and who look at the adverts are a particular demographic. They're commuting around London. But again, that is still broader. I think the biggest challenge they're going to face is making themselves heard, and then therefore getting enough customers to succeed. Whichever way they choose to do it, you can't just assume that the people around Shoreditch will use your product anymore. You have to either go mass market or you have to go very, very specialist, and then you decide on those specialist channels and you communicate via specialist blogs or specialist magazines, or you partner with Amex Black or whatever it is. But do you know what I mean? Or, you go with one of the members only clubs and then you get access to whatever. So I think it's making yourself heard is actually the biggest challenge amongst the noise.
To kind of just add on to that, I think also keeping that human element is extremely important. I mean, obviously now you have, AI and machine learning, and they're able to kind of come up with, robo-advisors, and they're able to kind of bundle things for you. And I think that there's something to be said about, as fintechs continue to rise, it's important to maintain that, human interaction and be able to, if someone has an issue, customer support, that they're able to hop on the phone with someone directly rather than spending, 2 hours waiting on, like chatting with someone online. It's really, I think that's extremely important.
And the human element as well, just to go back to some of the stories you touched on earlier, a human element that's empathetic actually is important, because having a human that is not empathetic or sympathetic or is actually in any way willing to help is not any better than just having a robot. Just as been putting that out there as somebody who's had several of those experiences recently.
And that's where I go back to the importance of internal comms, because that's about embedding your internal values and your tone of voice right through from leadership level down to the touch point that someone has when they interact with your product or your brand. Even if they do it virtually through your robot advisor, it needs to sound like you.
Great. Well, that was all. I mean, we could talk about that. We could talk about this, I think, for hours. But if people do want to reach out to all of you to get, to talk about any of these in more detail, get some more advice, how can they reach you, Stephanie?
You can reach me at stephanie@freetrade.io or on Twitter, StephanieKenda2.
I am Sharon at lithos.partners.
Sarah with an H at 11fs.com or on Twitter at Sarah Kachansky.
And it's Jessica W at lansons.com.
Great. And you can find me on Twitter at Val Christensen or on LinkedIn. Thanks very much for listening.